So Donald Trump would claim that he delivered the greatest economy in the history of the world to Americans. But as it turns out, there's another president who's delivered that kind of recovery, and it ain't Donald Trump. It's President Joe Biden. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to give you the ammo that you need to stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So Republicans love to talk about how great the economy was under President Trump. But with the latest job report, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has revealed that President Biden's economy is actually just as good as Trump's, even despite multiple crises that he's been dealing with that Trump never had to deal with. Let's talk facts here. And these are the kind of facts that you rarely see reported in the mainstream media and certainly would never see on Fox News. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the economy added 678,000 jobs last month. That's a shocker, a dramatic jump of almost 200,000 more than economists were expecting. What's more, in the prior 2 months, they adjusted the statistics upward by another 200,000 jobs, showing that the American economy continues to roar back, in huge contrast, by the way, to the way we came back so slowly and painfully in the wake of the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis. The unemployment rate has now fallen to 3.8%. The very best unemployment rate Trump ever achieved was 3.6%. And again, that was without all the crises that President Biden's had to be dealing with. What's more is labor force participation has come back up. And it's telling a particularly interesting story as you dig a little deeper into the numbers. For example, right now, there are almost 600,000 more men working in their prime working year of 25 to 54 than were working back before the pandemic. So where's this missing workforce that everybody's talking about? Well, it turns out that there are 1.2 million fewer women working in that age group. And that's likely due to the fact that these are the people who typically have to deal with things like childcare, which has been tougher to come by as a result of the pandemic, with schools that continue to be unreliable, and with caring for family members who are sick. These issues have made it harder for women to come back to work when men have had no such problems. What's more is older people older than the prime working years of 25 to 54, those older people, well, there's actually a pretty substantial decline in how many of them are working. Many of them have obviously decided that, you know what, they'd rather retire at this point. It's not worth it for them to go back to work. And who's to blame them? So the reality is that we are dealing with a smaller workforce, but that's due to two factors. Number one, older people deciding they don't want to work anymore. And number two, women who continue to be victimized by an unequal labor system. This data just calls once again for some progress on universal child care and better support for education in dealing with the pandemic. And better pay for teachers, by the way. Those are the kinds of things that would make a huge difference for women and enable them to be able to go back to work. But the irony is you ask most people, and most people don't realize that the economy is doing so well. Well, there are probably two reasons for that. The first one has to do with the media, which, as I said, first of all, the mainstream media reports from a negativity bias. That old saying that they're going to report on an airplane crash rather than all the airplanes that landed safely today. A focus on negative information is actually hardwired into people because at one point, when we were walking across the savanna of Africa, in the prehistoric era, that negativity bias and kind of being afraid of what was around the next corner, well, that likely saved our lives. But now it means that when you see the mainstream media, which is supposedly the mouthpiece for the Democrats, they're going to focus on negative information, even if it hurts Joe Biden, because what they're really interested in, by the way, is selling newspapers, or in this case, getting the attention of eyeballs on screens. But then you have the right-wing partisan media led by Fox News and OAN. And these organizations report bad news about Joe Biden, even if they have to make it up. There is no comparable media on the left. So as a result of that, the mainstream media, which liberals like myself primarily will read, tends to report negative information about the economy, simply because of the negativity bias that is inherent in people. And then you've got the right-wing media that's also reporting negative information because that's what they ideologically want to do. There's no balancing group the way that there was with Fox News desperately trying to support Donald Trump when he was president, despite him screwing up just about everything. The second reason people, though, are uncomfortable is that there's a certain sense that things are out of control. That sense is understandable with this pandemic continually catching us surprised in one way, shape, or form. But as we saw with the Omicron variant, even though this was some new variant that people were afraid of, it had virtually no impact on the economy and very little impact on the health of Americans, especially among those who've been vaccinated. As a result, and this was indicated by President Biden during his State of the Union speech, we're kind of getting to the point now we just need to move on. Unfortunately, life is full of risks. When I get into my car and drive to my office every day, I'm taking a risk. But it's a risk worth taking because, number one, I need the money from my job, and number two, I want to contribute to society through my work. So we've gotten to the point now where likely the COVID virus is a manageable risk, especially among those who've been vaccinated, like myself and I assume most of my viewers. But what's more then is that we have this issue with inflation. And inflation likely is due to a number of reasons. First of all, you've got the supply chain issues, which seem to be essentially being worked out, but certainly that had a huge impact on inflation. Secondly, you had the changing nature of what people were buying. People shifted from buying services to buying goods. So, for example, rather than going out to restaurants, people would buy refrigerators and stoves. Or rather than going to the gym, people would buy workout equipment for their home. That shift in priorities of what people bought impacted then what was available and really caught many manufacturers pretty much off guard, leading to, again, an imbalance in supply and demand, which then is going to drive up prices. Thirdly, you have corporations that have certainly been taking advantage of the situation. We saw on the one hand how Starbucks was complaining about the fact that it couldn't afford to pay its workers anything while raising prices to deal with inflation, while at the same time reporting historic corporate profits and huge pay raises for its CEO and top executives. If that doesn't strike you as consistent, well, they're definitely taking advantage of the situation. And lastly, there's the fact that Americans have a lot of money sloshing around, relatively speaking. That's due in large part as a result of the government's efforts to try to mitigate the crisis as a result of the coronavirus. The COVID Relief Act, for example, passed earlier this year with only Democratic support, without any Republicans in support of it, basically made it that despite this pandemic and despite this recession that we had as a result of it, poverty actually went down in the United States during that time. People's savings actually increased. That's unheard of in an economic crisis like that. But what that means is people have a lot of money to spend. And when they have a lot of money to spend, it means that, again, there's going to be more demand than supply. Prices are going to go up. Now, does that mean it was the wrong thing to do, to give people this money during this crisis? No. In fact, that's exactly what the government should be doing, is support the country's economy during times of crisis. That's when the government should be doing things like heavy spending and giving tax cuts to try to stimulate the economy and stimulate demand. And that's exactly what the government did this time, and that's part of why the economy is roaring back so quickly. And it's also probably part of why we're dealing with inflation. Now is the time for the government to pull back on that, which is exactly what the government's starting to do, and exactly, by the way, what the Fed's going to do as it starts increasing interest rates. But what this really kind of opens your eyes to is the fact that a lot of the inflation actually is due to the efforts of Trump back when he was president. Now I can hear it already. Those people are saying, oh, this is an example of you liberals with your Trump derangement syndrome. But listen to me for a second here. During the entire time he was president, until the emergence of COVID, basically Donald Trump never had a crisis that was not of his own making. He never had a war to deal with the way that Joe Biden does, or at least one that he was not prepared for. He failed to withdraw the troops from Afghanistan despite his promises to the contrary. He didn't have a massive pandemic until the very end of his presidency, which he completely dropped the ball on. And he had an economy that was doing very well, essentially the continuing strong economy that was started by President Obama. So this would be the time, given the good economy, when the government should be pulling back on its supports, pulling back on its spending, pulling back on its tax cuts, essentially saving its powder for when we deal with a financial crisis like we dealt with the COVID pandemic. But instead, Donald Trump, with his supposedly fiscally conservative Republicans, spent like drunken sailors, giving the incredibly wealthy a massive tax cut and dramatically increasing the deficit with heavy spending on top of that tax cut. Trump also engaged in pressuring the Fed to get them to actually reduce interest rates to continue this unsustainable boom of the economy. So during this time, when the Fed and the federal government should have been essentially storing up their powder to prepare for a crisis like we got with the pandemic, they instead were spending those funds, running up the credit card, and leaving us no kind of rainy day funds available for when the crisis did come. So as a result, the economy really was overheated under President Trump. And despite his claims that he was giving us the greatest economy in the history of the world, what he was really doing is he was borrowing against future generations, most notably this generation right now, and against President Joe Biden, who's now having to deal with the ramifications of the drunken sailor spending of that irresponsible administration and the Republicans who once claimed to be fiscally conservative. Well, if you want to check out more about the hypocrisy of the Republicans on their fiscal policy, check out this video that I did a while ago. You'll see just how much Republicans have no basis to argue that they're fiscally conservative anymore. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.